the issue of torture is the central one for America in relation to the Iraq War. The Iraq War will be known by Abu Ghraib the way that the Vietnam War was known by My Lai. These come to epitomize what the war is. For the American Psychological Association, not to recognize that is a grave failure of its responsibility as an ethical organization. Why it has refused to do that has to do with its own internal mechanisms, but it has very much to do with business as usual, with adapting to existing structures in the state or in the military, and with its heavy military influence affecting American Psychological Association decisions. The rejection of a call for a moratorium on psychologists being present at interrogation is another example of refusing to budge from conventional arrangements despite the extremity of the ethical crisis. It really comes to that. I would emphasize here the all-important issue of socialization to destructive behavior, or what I call socialization to evil. Socialization is not a small matter. It's not some superficial idea of getting along. It's a deep internalization of the procedures and the existing mores of a given environment which you must become part of. So psychologists in the military, psychiatrists too, in being socialized to the military, have a deep conflict between what they're taught in the way of serving human needs on the one hand and the requirements or pressures of command, which can get very destructive and can lead to torture, as they have on the other. And as long as psychologists are present at interrogations, working in the whole arena of advising interrogators, then they're deeply vulnerable to socialization to destructive behavior and socialization to evil. And the inability to recognize that is a double failure on the part of the American Psychological Association. It's a failure in terms of its professional psychological know-how and skill and recognition of what transpires. And worse, it's a deep ethical failure because it permits and encourages psychologists to be part of the process by which severe interrogation methods spill over into torture. I think that if a clear stand isn't taken on this issue, there are profound ramifications, all of them bad, for psychology as a profession. And those ramifications have already begun, so that they are both short-term and long-term. And they really have to do with the question of whether a profession and its organization, its official organization, whether they see themselves as in the service of humankind, of life-enhancing measures, mind-enhancing measures, or in the service of breakdown of mind. Here, the ethical issue, I think, is quite clear, but various interests and a claim to national security, that very slippery rationalization for so many things, interfere with what would be a clear-cut ethical position. Questions are now raised in this country about what the profession of psychology is all about, and over time, I think that young people going into psychology, young people with a certain amount of idealism about their profession, could be discouraged or could become more cynical about what they do, what they're expected to do, or maybe cynical enough to avoid the whole profession, that many psychologists, and an ever-increasing number of them, because many are in touch with me in one way or another, are becoming aware of these ethical questions more than they ever have been. Because they ask themselves, how did my profession get into a situation where it refuses to reject the presence of its members in potentially atrocity-producing situations, as I call them. And psychologists and psychiatrists alike can often feel, I'm part of a healing profession, so anything I do is per se good. Of course, that's entirely wrong. It may not be good, and it does depend upon the project you're serving. But I think that, and this is a hopeful development of this otherwise shameful situation, there is a sense that there's greater ethical awareness and that people are asking these questions in a way they haven't before, and that's very healthy. And psychologists and psychiatrists, who are usually seen as the secular equivalent of spiritual healers in our society. We're supposed to be healers. When we're present at these events, they're given a certain medical and spiritual legitimacy, and they're more acceptable to many people. In that sense, people like ourselves in healing professions have an added responsibility to look carefully at where we tread and where we disseminate our potential for legitimating situations and rendering highly destructive situations in some positive professional light. But when you stop to think about it, every psychological and psychiatric act has some kind of ethical and political component. It matters where we put out our shingles, who we treat and how we treat them. It matters what groups we lend psychological or psychiatric support to, where we put ourselves and how we live our lives. I have always felt that my activism has contributed to my scholarly work and my healing function. And as a matter of fact, even in doing research, which has always been dialogic, conversational, interview research, there has been a therapeutic component in the research. And then there has tended to be, for me, an activist component in connection with the subject of the research. How can one not take a stand about matters like Nazi doctors or Vietnam atrocity-producing situations in which Americans were placed, and the same in Iraq right now? How can one not take a stand against torture as a healer of any kind? In the case of torture, as we're describing it, most psychologists who engage, even those who are engaging in torture, can be ordinary husbands and fathers or wives or daughters, and buy their kids ice cream on Saturdays or whatever, but then have a second self involved in what they take to be either military or professional behavior or some combination of both. There is a profound dissociation. Doubling is a dissociative process. And that second self can do the dirty work and function separately from the relatively more humane self. We're all capable of doubling. It isn't just Nazi doctors. And we're capable of some kind of destructive behavior in a relatively autonomous portion of the self, and certain situations can bring out the potential destructiveness or even sadism in each of us. And in that sense, we're well to recognize that we're all capable of the maneuvers we recognize in our clients and patients. One of them is extreme dissociation, or psychic numbing, or doubling. And now we need to look at it in ourselves, where we see psychiatrists and psychologists complicit in torture. If the American Psychological Association were to take a strong stand prohibiting psychologists from being present at interrogations, this would have a liberating effect on all who care about the ethics of professional behavior in general, and all who care about the idealism of the profession of psychology. And it would also, I think, have an ennobling effect on the profession in the eyes of Americans who are thoughtful about these matters and sensitive to them. Of course, I know there are struggles with various interest groups in the association, concerns about what this would mean for those who work in prisons or other institutions, but it's mainly the military influence, I think, that holds the society back. And I think that military psychologists have a true interest in such a sanction. They can be protected from being put in atrocity-producing situations. There are anti-war military people and anti-nuclear military people who see destructive behavior on the part of the military as violating their military ethics. And the best of them have been trained and take seriously that internalization of military ethics, which requires that soldiers and those in the military defend their country and maintain their moral standards in doing so. So, in the long run, a sanction against potential participation in torture through presence in interrogations would be of profound benefit to those who may seem most against such a sanction right now, those concerned with the military. I came to the idea of atrocity-producing situations through my work with Vietnam veterans. And what I mean by that term is a very simple idea that certain environments can be so pressured militarily and psychologically that ordinary people, no better or worse than you or me, can enter that environment and be capable of committing atrocities. Capable of committing atrocities because of internalizing in the socialization process the mores of that environment. Psychologists and doctors and psychiatrists in general are drawn into the atrocity-producing situation by simply being part of the military. So doctors who participated in torture did so, in a sense, seemingly passively, but still significantly, by not reporting wounds that could only have been caused by torture, by colluding in the falsification of death certificates, and by collaborating with interrogators and giving them records, things that were quite illegal. This is an adaptation to the atrocity-producing situation of occupation in Iraq and of the go-ahead for torture given at the highest levels of the American government. Psychologists are drawn into exactly that situation, perhaps even more, because they don't have the medical profession's tradition of an oath to bring only healing and no harm to one's patients. And in a way, psychologists being drawn into an atrocity-producing situation is something that their own professional body should note and reject in the interest of everyone. The idea that psychologists should be kept around during interrogation in order to protect the person being interrogated, or avoid or advise against extreme harmful measures, that idea seems quite absurd to me, because there's no guarantee that a psychologist will, any more than anyone else, moderate those procedures. He or she can be caught up in the pressures of the group. Some of the worst abuses, it is now coming out in the use of originally Chinese communist methods, which I studied, of breakdown, to now be embraced by Americans to break down our prisoners. Some of the greatest roles in bringing that about have been played by psychologists. So there's no guarantee that psychologists will be any better than anyone else in this regard. The problem is the atrocity-producing situation itself, that of torture in this case, as opposed to the idea of having a moderating person there to stop it. And one must never underestimate the power of the military command under duress, where death is occurring, to intensify what is put forward as a necessarily destructive policy, namely torture. And one must not underestimate the tendency of everybody, including psychologists and psychiatrists, to be the potential for being drawn into that kind of environment. So you have to look at the environment rather than put in protective people who are no better or worse than others entering the environment. What I meant by the superpower syndrome in writing a book with that title was an American sense of being the most powerful military force in the world, and a sense of entitlement to that ultimate world hegemony. It means that you lend yourself to that sense of omnipotence. And a sense of omnipotence includes two things. One is a sense of higher purpose. Anything we do is justified because there's a higher purpose in American hegemony and in American ethical perfection on the one hand, and there's a kind of ultimate power or omnipotence, we can do anything, on the other. And those two tendencies lend themselves to extreme measures such as torture. The idea is we're threatened by an evil enemy, and we polarize good and evil in some clear and absolute way, and therefore any measures, this is really a definition of what I call totalism or ideological totalism, any measures are justified in combating that evil and in asserting what we consider to be our good. Therefore, torture is performed for higher purposes, ostensibly ethical reasons. And in that sense, the superpower syndrome, as a general embrace on the part of so many American leaders, becomes really a source of destructive behavior, torture, the Iraq War in general, and the illusory sense that we can control world history. But I would give greater emphasis to the ideologies we embrace. It's, after all, certain kinds of ideologies. The totalistic American ideology of superpower syndrome leads to torture. A totalistic communist ideology of communist good and capitalist evil has led to communist mass murder. And ordinary people get caught up in these atrocity-producing situations and are capable of joining in a process of harming or even killing others. So it becomes really crucial what idea structures take hold and dominate a nation, or let's say the society in general. In a way, it pertains to what we've been talking about, what idea structures take hold in our profession and in the organizations that are supposed to preserve what's best in our professions. Are they ideas that say we can do anything in the world and our profession will help do even destructive things in the name of what is ostensibly a higher good? Or will they take a stand about human ethics in every situation? I think active participation in torture is criminal, so that an active torturer becomes a war criminal. Yes, it is criminal behavior. There are all kinds of international statutes and protocols which we hold to and render it criminal. And that's why this administration has gone through so many evasive and scandalous legalisms to attempt to justify torture and decriminalize it. But it is criminal. It's as if there's always a battle between these more humane principles and various destructive forces. The battle is never completely won. But how can we look at ourselves in the mirror if we don't take a stand for the more humane developments and in opposition to the destructive ones like torture? And doing that means that we retain clearly our sense of torture ethically and legally as criminal. You know, what I and others call the moral imagination is something we all need all the time. There are certain critical moments where it becomes crucial that we retain a moral imagination. And sometimes circumstances blur and remove the moral imagination all too easily. A friend of mine during the Vietnam War did an informal study of talking to helicopter pilots, medium bomber pilots, Americans, and high-level bomber pilots. The helicopter pilots could see that they were shooting Vietnamese and killing them. They could they could actually see them right there, and they were troubled and had all the symptoms that Vietnam veterans had. Those who flew medium-level bombers could see little specks on the ground and might have felt a little something, but they could easily dismiss it. Those who flew the high-level bombers couldn't see anything. They were on instruments. It took real moral imagination. They had to imagine what was happening on the ground in order to have some balanced view of what was going on. Sometimes when you get caught up in a situation of torture or of destructive behavior in general, the environment is so intense, as can be the case where there's combat or where there's death in a military situation, that the moral imagination is eliminated or suppressed or unavailable. That really indicates that we have to nurture our moral imagination. We do well to have the moral imagination going at all times. It's really imagining ethical questions insistently and constantly in the way that we seek to imagine psychological questions as part of our work. I think that we've reached a certain rock bottom in American society with the transgressions of the present administration, so that the country has turned against this administration, turned against the president in his ratings, without fully realizing how extreme, how destructive this administration has been. I think almost any new administration would improve things enormously, but I think that a new Republican administration would be problematic. So there's a really directly political issue here in which a Democratic administration with a president who has some sensitivity to these issues could change things radically. When I finished my study of Nazi doctors, some friends who read it said, okay, pretty heavy stuff. What do you think about human nature now? And they expected me to say, you know, worthless, no good, forget it. But my answer was, we can go either way. We have the potential. Our wiring, in my view, our genetic structures don't take us toward evil or toward good, but give us the potential for either.